I guess we'll. Okay.
Thank you.
So I mean, there's a lot of points in both of your talks, but I think one thing we should maybe start out as kind of a ground rule, and is the difference between general intelligence, artificial general intelligence, or AGI, and specialized intelligence. I think most of the science fiction is about this kind of Terminator, general artificial intelligence, and I think we all agree that it's possible, but I think everyone disagrees when or if it's going to be, what it's going to be like. So I think maybe we don't need to talk about that today, because I think we have plenty to talk about the specialized intelligence, because it's actually imminent and already happening to us, and I think that's maybe, is that okay to focus on that?
Sure.
And there was a great article recently in Nature magazine, and actually it was a quote of Pedro Dominguez in his book, The Master Algorithm, and the quote was, and I'm going to say it slowly so the interpreters can get it. People worry that computers will get too smart and take over the world, but the real problem is that they're too stupid and they have already taken over the world. You know, and I think that, you know, and talking about your biases and talking about sort of these things, I think that one of the issues that, to try to tie it into this conference, which is about city and also about arts and all of the other things, is, you know, this stuff that you showed is hard to do. And most of the people who are involved in artificial intelligence are engineers. And engineers talk to other engineers. And I think one of the things that I feel, and I'd love to get your view, is one, since it affects everybody, it affects society, it affects all of us now, and is like your biases are going to start deploying things that have real societal values. How do we bridge this? Because I don't think that, like the training that you were showing, that we understand that sort of, you made it very easy to understand, which was great, but most people don't know how to train AIs, and they're not really involved in that, right? And so I'm curious how you think that we can build, or should we be building, societal ethics and values into machines, and as two computer scientists, what is the responsibility of your community?
Okay. Well, I think that we need to build values into these systems that are better than our own values. That's actually the challenge. Mm-hmm. By default, the values are our values because the training data are our own training data. One of the things that I think has been revealed by some of these automated systems, I'm thinking about, for example, not very well peer-reviewed, not very well analyzed systems that in the US have been used sometimes to decide whether somebody in the criminal justice system is going to reoffend. And it turns out that its performance is terrible. Mm-hmm. It's almost as bad as the performance of a human. Mm-hmm. Because it turns out that human judges and human lawyers and so on are full of all of the same problems. And it's only when we begin to actually automate and to systematize that we are even that we even have the conditions under which we can measure some of these very unpleasant biases. So then this forces us to take a step back and ask not only about how we imbue human values into AI, which has been a lot of the conversation, but how we imbue what we wish human values were.
Or but that's difficult when you say what we wish, right? Because there are certain American politicians who wish different values than what we might wish. So there's also the meta connection, which is how do we plug it into a political system or philosophical system to even get to that point, right?
Right. Yeah, very hard question.
Yeah, I think the problem with the AI is particularly like what you give it to the system as a data. That's everything actually. That's they don't really actually at this moment they don't really actively search for other data and then try to correct the problem or the bias in the data. Of course, like in the future, system might actually autonomously actually prove into like a new kind of data. That's also scary as well. But so like if you actually intentionally actually bias the data, that you can actually create a system reacting to that way. So that actually is the reliability of the, like a trainer sort of, or like how you get the data and get things trained, would be a critical input. At the same time, actually, having said that, how reliable are we? I mean, in terms of human beings, that's another issue. Because many of the accidents, like airline accidents, are actually caused by human factors, and also like automobile. Like that's why people want to go in autonomous driving car. Is like that's a human, issues.
The self-driving cars will have a much higher bar for safety than human drivers, who are actually terrible at the job. We're very poor drivers.
But again, there's obvious safety, and then there's bias. It's slightly different, right? So, for instance, maybe the accidents will go down, but should rich people get to where they're going faster than poor people? Should rich people be able to break the law? Should politicians be able to break the law? And when you go to China, you always see these motorcades of all the politicians going through. Should that be allowed? And those are societal values, right? And I think it gets tricky because we did a study at MIT Media Lab where some people argue whether it's a good problem, but it's called the trolley problem, which tries to get people to tell you what they think about self-driving cars. Most people say that they think it's okay for the passenger of a car to be sacrificed to save more lives. So it's very utilitarian. But most people agree they would not buy that car if they had to be the passenger. So this sort of shows that the market isn't really the best way to decide what the values should be.
It's also culturally dependent, right? I think you're the one who actually pointed out to me some time ago that in Japan and the US, the results are somewhat different.
And just like at different companies. I found, one company, everybody was more law-abiding and less utilitarian. But the question, though, is...
That wasn't Volkswagen by any chance.
It was a Japanese car company. But it ties a little bit to your... Because you sort of said at the end where you had a federated, so you have lots of little AIs. And we were talking about in the waiting room that AlphaGo, which is the computer that won at Go, it actually didn't use all making more computers didn't make it smarter. There was a limit to the number of computers it could use to maximize its intelligence. So a lot of people think the more computers you have, the smarter it is. That's not necessarily true, right? So then it starts to feel like society, right? Because in society we have many people, and there's an old word that we use called collective intelligence, which is the intelligence of society is theoretically better than the intelligence of an individual. So do you think it's going to be a society of AIs with different values?
Oh, for sure. Like one of our key strengths in this biomedical research is we actually have like a whole range of machine learning algorithms, and we found out like some of the machine learning is really good on a specific type of data analytics, and but like it's terrible in others. Like there's one way they actually combine the multiple machine learning result to get the best result. So those things there. So like there are specific characteristics on each algorithm seems to be, and there's a strength and weakness. So I think at the same time, like IBM Watson actually, they have like hundreds of different algorithms to come up with the most plausible answer for the Jeopardy. So like it's more heterogeneity of the algorithm or the inference mechanism. I think it's really critical to get the intelligence. That's at least like what I understand so far. And as technology moves forward, like we may have a slightly different angle, but like so far, I think that's what we know today.
Often prize-winning algorithms in competitions for narrow AI have been won by mixture of expert type techniques that have many approaches working in parallel. But there's also another aspect, I think, to this sort of limits to scaling that I think arises from the physics of our world. We live in 3 dimensions. If that's a very limited amount of space in which for communication to happen. This is why as brains scale up, large brains are almost entirely white matter, which is the cables, essentially, like Rosenblatt's perceptron. And so you can't make a brain of our own biological architecture infinitely smart by just growing it, because at some point it's overwhelmed by wires. And similarly, communications for AI, you can't have every piece of smart dust somehow connected simultaneously to the internet. Where is all the radio going to go?
But then it starts to become similar to society in the city, right? Because in the city, you're also constrained. And as an architect or an urban planner, you have a certain amount of control over the architecture of the system, but you don't program everything. And so I'm curious what you think in terms of AI. What is the most similar what do you think the communication sort of way that the AIs are going to make a decision? Is it like a market? Is it like a city? Is it like academia? I mean, what do you think the coordination mechanism will be?
Biological system.
Biological system.
Yes. Well, one thing that biology has is local communication.
Yes, that's right.
Right. So your RoboCup illustration is also beautiful. All these robots are aware of their own local information environment, and they communicate peer to peer. And I think, especially in the context of urban planning, if we're not thinking about that kind of autonomous intelligence and local communication, then you're making a very brittle system. There is a Twitter feed whose name I don't think I can repeat on stage. That talks about some of the the failure modes of my system is updating, so I couldn't turn on my lights, or the internet is down, so I can't lock my car. These are not the kinds of failures that one would like to see happen at city scale.
Yeah, I think it's really important to actually have like a robustness on the reliability, resilience of the system. Because if you have like a distributed, or like if you have a a single modality, if that is truncated, then you lose the control of the part of the system. And for the biological system, what is really critical is like you have like a multiple redundant pathways or multiple redundant modalities as well. So like you can actually compensate for that. So that will be very important. That's you have to intentionally build into that.
But the one thing you're leaving out, though, is that we're designed by evolution, which has killed billions of years of living things to get us to where we are. It's a very expensive way of designing. And actually, Neri's going to talk about this a little bit in her session, which is about how do we design like biology without having to go through the process of survival of the fittest and mutations. I mean, because I think our systems, like our immune system, it would be very difficult to design from scratch, right? Do you think we can?
Rules. Oh, so like one is actually if we need to actually, I think we should be able to actually in a way, but like so like what we need is actually a mechanism that actually evolve, and then how fast we can go. So like if you can actually have like a virtualized space, and then if you got like a very fast evolution process and the selection process, I should be. I'm pretty confident that I think we should do that. But at the same time, like what would be like an environment we can set up for that? So it could be pretty much limited by the kind of a framing actually we can give it to the system. That actually limit. So if we actually set like a kind of really narrow framework, actually systems simply adapt to that, and we're not going to get something very interesting or useful.
There are many things that biological evolution doesn't do that human design does, like diagnose. We optimize for things like diagnosability, explainability, robustness under well-characterizable conditions. Our immune systems are an excellent example. I mean, they work pretty well. But on the other hand, in places like Japan that are too clean, apparently there's explosions of autoimmune disorders and things. Which are, somebody was telling me last night, I think it was Kevin, that the Amish don't have this because they're exposed to a much richer microbiome. No, I think we might hear more about this actually either later.
We'll hear more later.
So these are the sorts of failures that. We would think differently if we were designing such a system. It wouldn't be a mess of cables the way some of the diagrams that you put up were.
But I think many of us have talked about this. But I think that society evolves as well as a machine, right? So and evolution's not like you just kind of move forward. So like the taxi. I think you were telling me in one presentation that the people, once they got in the car, started to feel comfortable. And we have personal robots that we send to hospitals. And once they're in the hospitals, the children love the robots, and they do all kinds of things with robots that you didn't imagine. And so when you deploy, people's impressions change, so the design will change. And I think, in fact, this is where we're talking about competitiveness. I think Japan is actually, in fact, has an advantage, because I think sort of from our value system, I think Japanese don't have as much of a religious aversion to machines as say the West. And we also don't have the workforce problem, which I want to talk about in a minute, where I think in Europe they're saying that they want to tax any autonomous robot because they'll be taking human jobs. And I think there's I think what will be interesting to see is how does society evolve together, and what does this coevolution look like? I don't know if you have any any thoughts on whether we'll have a single global sort of emergence of AI, or whether we'll start to see very different robots and AIs in different countries?
Well, we have already started to see that.
Yeah.
But I also think that the word evolution is not quite right. You know, I mean, evolution is a very particular Darwinian process,
Right.
and we're not in that era anymore, even with respect to biological systems. We are designing the huge bulk of biological, you know.
But that's true. But although I think if you look at Chomsky and others, they'll say that you have different layers. So you have the biological layer, but then you have on top of language, you have culture, which does also evolve in its own peculiar way at a different speed beyond.
It doesn't have natural selection. It
Well,
has
it kind
other
of
forces.
does. It kind of does. Fashion and things do have some attributes that are very similar.
Yes, but not the literal process of things dying and sexually reproducing. And those differences matter. And the fact that systems can be designed matters. So you know, there's an epical theory of history that I like very much. The source will come to me in just a moment. It's essentially the idea is that there is an era of physics which, you know, was up until about, I don't know, 3 billion years ago, and then an era of replicators, which, you know, you could draw the line arbitrarily, but it goes up until maybe a couple of hundred years ago, and now we're in the era of design, and there are fundamentally new forces in play. When systems can be designed by intelligences. It's not the same thing. Things do also get selected. Those layers exist in parallel, as you say, but you can't, the old rules can't be kind of blindly applied either.
I agree. I think evolution, when you define it, has a whole bunch of parameters, many of which don't apply anymore, but some do, I think.
So like, I think like, you know, one of the issues, like, you know, our systems, I think we going to die and we don't want to die. At least prematurely. And that actually became motivation to actually change the behavior. So like if you actually something like it hurts, like you want to avoid it. Why this like you know reaction came from? That's the innate reaction that came from. Like you know like so that actually build up and that actually started governing all the behaviors like, on top of higher level. And like artificial system, like how you build into that, and that's really the tricky issue. Like how you actually decommission the system, or like even if decommission system actually have the instinct, you know, propensity to avoid the decommissioning, or no, it's not there actually. So like that part actually is something really missing in you know artificial system, but like that's deeply embedded in any of the biological system, as far as I understand. At the same time, then we actually try to mimic that process by our sort of parameter tuning or whatever the framing that we give. So that's come back to the you know the initial discussion, like how we can actually frame the world, and that actually tend to be artificial. And then if we actually do artificial framing, then you know system actually simply fit to that and not going to go beyond. So like then you know that would be a quite substantial difference in whether we can go like you know make the biological evolution pathway or artificial design, you know. Artificial, you know, evolution process. That would be
but we need to surpass. I mean, so for example, I'm sure you've heard about. There's a very rare disease in which babies are born unable to feel pain.
Yes.
And there are terrible outcomes for kids with this. They tear out their eyes and so on because, you know, it turns out that every baby learns very quickly that when they touch their eye, it's no good. Don't do it. But we are collectively as a species missing the sense of pain. That comes from multi-generational wrong choices, from environmental destruction, from not exercising empathy at the right scale, from all sorts of things of this sort that we're not really adapted evolutionarily to. This is one of many ways in which we need to design systems that surpass what we individually as biological life forms have done. And we don't have the luxury of preparing a million identical Earths, you know, each of which have slightly different pain functions and so on, and just letting it evolve and seeing which one wins. We have to actually design.
But I think this is where the design gets complex, because it's a complex adaptive system. And you're not necessarily in charge of all the forces that affect it. So, for instance, you know, our brain learns by producing pain or dopamine to reinforce learning. So if you were to look at corporations, they're reinforced by money. And so even your company, Google, you may be trying to make the world better and unbiased and things like that, but there are certain people in your organization that are going to put pressure on you as a unit to push the code to a certain direction to optimize for some kind of financial function. It may not be the whole thing, but it's definitely some energy that you're solving for, right? And so,
given that parameter, actually, the factor can dynamically and properly change because, like, carbon dioxide emissions, like, 30, 40 years ago, if we ever thought about that would be corporate index. So now it's a serious one, actually.
So but I think though what happens is you can be focused at the wrong layer. So for instance, right now, politics, a lot of people want to redesign part of the political system. But in the United States, at least, it's mostly captured by money. And so, for instance, if you look at, there's a very good story where in the US you have the gun numbers and you have names. And every time you buy a gun, they take the number of the gun and the name and they send it to a central office that's run by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Department. And everything is stored in boxes and there's no computer because the National Rifle Association passed a law that you can't computerize it. So every time somebody wants to look up a gun, they go through microfiche, right? So it's not that design of that system is poorly done. It's that the environment has created a system in which you can't redesign that piece.
Well, so the design is not intelligent.
That's right. So I think so it's like it's not exactly evolution, but I think it is a kind of game system that we're going to be deploying these things in. And this is sort of gets back to my point is that the market won't create self-driving cars that will necessarily do the best result for saving lives necessarily. And so one of the questions that I have is, you're at Google, you're at Sony, is the corporate environment the right environment to deploy AI? Do we trust companies to do this? The US government is putting military funding, the third offset. They've asked for $18 billion for AI. And we have China starting to say they're going to do it. And the thing is that the money is all there. I mean, the reason you're at Google and not at an academic institution is you have the resources and you have the ability to do more than any academic institution. So in the past, if we were making the atom bomb, we would have been mostly government academia. Right. But this time AI is run by companies.
Your analogy is spot on. I mean, I think that the model that government is benign is belied by the whole phrase Manhattan Project, which somehow has been repurposed to mean great, ambitious, wonderful project. I mean, the Manhattan Project, let's be clear, was about designing nuclear weapons, which here of all places, we should understand was not the greatest thing that ever happened, by boon of human creativity. I think that where I am working now, Google, has a combination of money and resources and better ethics than the other places that that I have tried, might try. It's not perfect. I'm certainly being well supported in the bias work and in a number of other things. Can I imagine places where I would be even better supported in those things? Yes, I mean, if I had my dream, but then there are no resources. And the government, so I don't think that we have, as a society, really designed ourselves into a space where we have the ideal form.
It reminds me of the poll that we did earlier about whether we think the world is getting better or worse, and it's like 50-50, right? And because we don't really trust our systems, our government, our markets. And so my question is, with augmentation and acceleration, and to your point, if the biases are just being built into the system's just getting better at doing whatever we're currently doing. I mean, there's no statistical data to prove that an AI world is going to be any better for the human condition, other than maybe being more efficient, right?
Well, in a part of that, I think like all the traffic accidents and all sort of thing, I think that would be certainly a bit of a medical side. And at the same time, that's pretty much an optimizations, in a way. It's like, whether AI can actually come up with like something really completely novel. I'm saying like scientific discovery, that would really challenge you. So I think what the AI good at is really get like optimal solutions and more efficient solutions.
But it doesn't tell us what to optimize.
Yeah, that's right. Because optimizing for longer life might not optimize for happiness, right? It probably doesn't, right?
No, I think it'll create all sorts of problems.
Yeah. And this ties to this other question, is the future of work. So just let's for a minute assume that AI and robots start to take jobs. It's possible, it's not definite, but it's possible that we will have more efficiency and fewer people have to work. And a lot of the people who are very utopian think, oh, great, then we can sit around and play video games. But it turns out work is more than just economic value. It creates purpose, it creates structure, it creates meaning, it creates happiness. And I think, one of the things, and we talked about this with some clergy the other day, but that there are things like academia, music, and arts where you can have purpose without necessarily getting a financial benefit.
And conversely, I mean, I think that it's a greatly privileged position to say that work is about purpose without looking carefully at what, in the US, for example, what a lot of people in the more rural parts of the country are doing for work, 2 or 3 jobs, doing menial things. Yeah. If you ask them whether they're getting purpose from that, I think the answer is no.
Right.
It's a very patronizing point of view to say that.
But then you look at Bahrain or UAE, and you find a lot of people who don't have to work,
and that's on the other side of the
but
spectrum.
also don't feel purpose. Or you go to suburban Chicago and watch Wayne's World. That's what life is like when you don't have to work.
So in the 2x2 grid of work and purpose, there's stuff in each quadrant.
Yeah. And so I think the question really sort of becomes, and this is sort of, I think we should start planning it, which is, if there is a future where work and money becomes somewhat delinked for some people, is there some sort of happiness measure or purpose measure or structure? I mean, academia is one, where faculty are generally underpaid and overworked, but with a little bit more money probably would be happier. But I feel like there are certain structures, and also I think we've been, Takenaka-san is an economist, so I want to poke him about this later, but we measure value by GDP, countries and cities by GDP.
Well, Bhutan has taken another path,
but mothers aren't part of GDP. Their work is not part of GDP, right? If mothers had AIs and they could be doctors and they could produce all this value, shouldn't that be counted into the health of a city? And so I'm wondering whether we should be rethinking what we optimize for. Because I think the problem right now, if you leave it up, even if you're nice and friendly and do no evil like Google, you're still being forced to measure yourself with money at some point. And we do have carbon and all these things, but there's still, it's a little bit of a trade-off game with money, right? Yeah. So don't you think?
At the same time, like when things converge into one way, like something happens actually usually to really reverse the trends actually. So I think like our roles as a humankind actually could like disrupt things. That's kind of AI is not good at, I guess. It's not designed to do that. So like if we can actually come up with something really disruptive. Change things. That would be very interesting.
Troublemaker.
There are models like Mondragon or like Bhutan that pose other kinds of functions to optimize for that I think are very interesting and that have been shown to work at some kind of scale.
And it is interesting also, I refer back to the poll, how most of the people here seem to think that culture is more important for the success of a city than its technology or its economy. So I think we sort of emotionally understand that there's something else.
Yeah, but at the same time, like I went to actually Bhutan. Actually, it's like it's a happiness because it's a very special conditions. That's a really limited information availability and a very special geographic conditions, very special like a political system actually, or the Tibetan Buddhism actually. So like that. Under that condition, I think they actually survived to be very happy.
Well, I mean, science, the beginning of science in England in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries was also practiced under very special conditions by gentlemen scientists. Right. And now we've managed to take those conditions and generalize them in interesting ways. So I don't think
it would be very challenging, like if that kind of model actually generalizable.
Right. Could we generalize? And if we can't, maybe that's the answer to the Fermi paradox.
And it seems like historically you had the clergy were the philosophers, and then the physicists were the philosophers, and now the AI guys have become the philosophers of the day. So I guess you guys need to have some thought leadership. We have like a minute left. I don't know if you have any last comments on this point.
Last thoughts?
No?
I feel like I ran over already.
Okay, I'll finish. Either of you, are you both optimistic about the future with AI?
Yes, optimistic. In a short run, I think there will be a setback. But in the long run, I'm very optimistic. Yeah. Because a little bit of hype going on now.
I am optimistic. I mean, I think that there's a lot of negative media about everything, about violence, about AI, about existential threats. The trend of human progress is very clear. It's toward better life, toward more inclusive way of thinking about others, toward less violence, toward larger scale and better organization, toward more options. The only challenge, I think, is that as this curve goes up, the oscillations potentially go up too. So the question is whether we get to a point where the oscillations are so large that, that catastrophic events become inevitable. That I think we have no way of knowing.
And I'm also roughly optimistic, but I think that we have to plug this AI machine into the rest of society, both at the academic level, at the cultural level, because I think right now this engine has become a little bit detached.
I would rephrase. I think it is plugged into society as it is now, and the challenge is to improve what society is.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
That's great.